Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is a very, very significant Wednesday in the nation's history. It is the day following Election Day. It is the 5th day of November, 2014, and I think everybody I've talked to so far today is obviously talking about the results of the election. Not only the people that we meet in real life, but if you turn on the media, every single channel on television is talking about election results, and prognosticators are out there guessing as to what the overall significance of the election results will be. I think as all of us are. I don't know that the results were a shock. I think that they were anticipated. I do believe, however, that perhaps the degree of the Republican victory was a little bit beyond even what they had hoped for. They were obviously targeting a takeover of the Senate, and they more than accomplished that, and as well as holding on to a number of not only senatorial seats but also governorships, which appeared to be in trouble. One of the things that I found interesting is that the 2 or 3 Senate Republican seats that were at play in the election were held. So in a sense, the Republicans seemed to suffer few, if any, losses, and almost unanimous victory whenever there was a contest held. So it's quite a day in many ways. And before we went on the air, Bob Kincaid and I were kind of bouncing it back and forth and sharing our perceptions. And Bob made the point that I believe he perhaps made on his program last night, and that is about what it says about West Virginia, the way that West Virginia went. I made a comment to my wife this morning, and she kept saying, "You ought to write an article on this. You really ought to write an article on this." And I said, "Well, I don't know, because I every once in a while I think back to one of John Grisham's excellent pieces that was done 4 or 5 years ago, and one of the major issues in that particular book by John Grisham was the treatment of the election in West Virginia politics of Brent Benjamin to the West Virginia State Supreme Court, and Grisham's comment in his book that West Virginia was for sale, and the money came. The money came to be. The election was bought, and Brent Benjamin ended up on the West Virginia State Supreme Court. Since that time, Brent Benjamin has been Chief Justice twice, I believe, of the Supreme Court. Just more than 5 years ago. I guess this book probably closer to a decade ago now. I've often thought about that. And the one reaction I had this morning is the one thing, for the first time, West Virginia does not stand alone as being a state with a price tag on it. I think we've been joined by a number of others. So no longer does West Virginia stand alone as the state, the one state out of the 50 that everybody knows is for sale. Turns out after yesterday's election that a number of other states were for sale as well. I think the only thing left to be decided prior to yesterday was what the price would be. And I think in this election we've pretty well found out. So in a sense, I guess maybe you could say that West Virginia's status may have been elevated a little bit only because those that were claiming to be so far above it have kind of come down, and therefore West Virginia no longer stands out in bold and italics like it did prior to yesterday. Incredible day in a lot of ways. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. In dealing with the elections and thinking about them, I kind of made a decision that perhaps it might be better to change our program a little bit today, change the presentation that I had in mind a little bit. You'll recall that the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center, which was a week ago, which was last Wednesday, we were well into George Washington's farewell address, and we were specifically focusing on Washington's analysis, if you will, or Washington's write-up on American nationalism, on the idea of nationalism and what it contained, what it required, what was necessary to promote it, and why it was so important. And the reason that I spent as much time on the farewell address, Washington's farewell address, as I have, and I want to continue to do that, is because I really believe that this emphasis on the ingredients of nationalism is one of those unknown factors in Washington's farewell address. That traditionally when people mention Washington's farewell address, they usually mention one of two things: either his criticism of parties, or second, his warning to the nation against the dangers of so-called entangling alliances in foreign policy. And those tend to be the two major issues or themes or conclusions, if you will, that most people have traditionally taken from Washington's farewell address. But in reading the address, which we began to a week ago today and on last Wednesday's program, one of the things you realize is that in building his case against parties and the importance, emphasizing the importance of holding the nation together and maintaining and reassuring the fact that we remain one nation, Washington is doing us a tremendous service in explaining the ingredients of the concept of nationalism, which I think a lot of people know what it is, but it's one of those things that everybody knows what it is, but when it comes down to trying to define it or explain it, people have difficulty doing that. I think Washington has addressed, inadvertently perhaps, but in his detail and in the depth of his analysis, I think Washington has done us a service, because he has resolved what I think has been one of the great mysteries or unsolved mysteries, if you will, of American history, which is trying to basically be able to get our arms around this idea of nationalism. I think, to be very honest with you, as I think back historically, I think that nationalism leaves a very bad taste in people's mouths for a lot of reasons. I think the rise of fascism in the early 20th century after World War I, and especially in response to the financial crisis that followed World War I, first in Europe and then finally in the United States as well during the 1930s, and brought to power in nation after nation very powerful figures who were able to take tottering, reeling nations in tow and hold them together and in effect preserve them as nations. This was the period in Italy. It was Mussolini. In Germany, post-war Germany, it was Adolf Hitler. In Japan, it was the military. In the United States, it was FDR. And the emergence, ultimately in the mid-30s, of FDR's so-called New Deal program. And I think that the result of the extremes of of nationalism, the extremes of nationalism being fascism, have left a very bad taste in people's mouths. We saw what the Nazis did in the Holocaust. We saw the brutality with which Japan invaded China in the late 30s. We saw the horrors of the Second World War on the Eastern Front, not only in relationship to the Holocaust, but also in relationship to the Eastern Front phase of the war between Germany and Russia, Stalin's Russia, and the brutality and loss of life and the tremendous devastation that the Soviets suffered at the hands of the Germans, and the clear implication that Roosevelt and Churchill, in pursuing military strategy and military policy for prosecuting a two-front war, the Pacific War, as well as the war in Europe, seemed more than willing to postpone the launching of the so-called Second Front in Europe, which Stalin had been advocating throughout as a way to take the pressure off the Soviet Union by forcing Germany to fight a two-front war. And as we know, the Second Front, the so-called Normandy invasion, didn't happen until June 6, 1944. By that time, the Russians had suffered immeasurable damage, both in loss of life and in destruction of property. And I personally think that much of the most negative aspects of the Cold War, which followed World War II, are in large part attributable to Stalin's desire for revenge, if you will, for what the Allies did to the Soviets during the war. I think there's a lot of substance and a lot of credibility and evidence to support that. My point is that World War II, for many reasons, left a very, very bad taste in people's mouths about the concept of nationalism. The fact of the matter is, nationalism is incredibly important, and it is absolutely vital to the functioning of a modern nation in the modern world. I would suggest to you that the way I like to define nationalism, because it gives it meaning to me, is to suggest that nationalism is in effect the idea of community on a national scale. That in promoting nationalism, what nations are doing, what governments are doing, what governments must do, is to find every means possible to promote the concept of community, because the stronger a sense of community and unity and togetherness is, the stronger the sense of oneness defines a nation, the easier it is to govern, the more viable government becomes. And so I think that while obviously fascism is an extreme form of nationalism, it's nationalism gone wild, if you will. The fact of the matter is, nationalism is a very important concept related to governance. And I think that's the contribution that Washington's farewell address brings to us. I think Washington goes to great lengths to explain to us what nationalism, which at the time Washington is writing his farewell address, which is in 1796, the nation is hell-bent to create nationalism in order to try to govern a nation of 13 states, which quickly become 14 states, to bring them under the control and under the tutelage of the new government under the Constitution. And part of that is to weaken or break down the traditions of localism of loyalties as state and regions, which so defined the United States during this period, and find ways to transfer this national loyalty to the nation as opposed to the states or as opposed to local individuals or local institutions. And I think at one point in one of our programs here at the Virtual Center, in looking at the details of Alexander Hamilton's financial program presented to Congress in the early 1790s, there's no question that Hamilton's entire program was designed to provide the economic ingredients of a program for creating nationalism in America by wedding the right people to the new government, by taking finding ways to bring institutions and individuals whose support for the new government was necessary to its success, to bring them to the fore and to give them reasons to support the new government, whether it be tax policies, whether it be protective tariffs to promote manufacturing, whether it be the stabilization of the national economy under the creation of a United States bank, whether it be the promotion of internal improvements in order to improve the movement of goods and services back and forth internally, as well as the securing of commercial advantage in business overseas with other nations. All of these things, it seemed to me, are part and parcel of Hamilton's so-called financial program. And all of that is designed to promote at least the economic aspect, or I use this term in class a number of times because I think it's a word that students need to know and hear used a lot, and that would be the economic manifestation of nationalism. I was mentioning to students that the idea of manifestation, I think, is it's a word that everybody needs to know and understand and be able to not get thrown by it. It's one of those big words that we hear that we hear and read about that are thrown around all the time without meaning, and that was one of the issues I dealt with. Anyway, that's the reason for Washington's farewell address. However, I think given the fact that today is the day after such an important election in our nation, I think there's another piece that came into my hands that I would like to share with you on this day after the election here at the Virtual Center. It's a piece that I want to thank Gene, who is part of the Head On Radio Network family, for sending me the link to it. It is a wonderful piece, and I'm going to pause for maybe 20 seconds here because I need to get my hands on that particular piece, and it'll be just a quick moment. Thank you for your patience. I am back. I apologize for that short break, but it was real. Bob Kincaid and I were in conversation just prior to when we came on the air today, and I told him I was going to take the last few seconds and run out and grab a cup of coffee, and Bob said, "You don't have time. We're on in less than 10 seconds." What I was really going to do was go out and grab the program, which I had left on the table in another room. So I now have it, and we are ready to go. Let me begin, first of all, by thanking you for your time today, tuning in to the Virtual Center. We are at 19 minutes after the hour, 19 minutes after 1 in the East. We are now on Standard Time. no longer on Eastern Daylight Time, and it is 1:19 in the East. I want to thank you for your continued support for the Virtual Center and your continued support for the Head On Radio Network. As an observation and aside, probably a little bit more of a political comment than I ought to be making at this point, but I would suggest that one result, if you will, of the elections yesterday seems in my mind to be the importance which the results of the election seem to give to the need for the Head On Radio Network and for programs like Head On and like Bob's program in the evening and our program here at the Virtual Center and all of these. I think the nation is embarking in a direction as a result of yesterday's elections, which I think makes the kind of conversation and it makes the kind of alternative perspective on some of the key issues of the day even more important than perhaps they were before. So I do want to thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and of the Virtual Center. I want to, again, commit to you my intent to do the very best I can to make the time that you are willing to give to us, and we know that in today's world, time is one of the most valuable commodities any of us have, and to ask you to regularly give over a portion of your time to this program and to this network. I want you to know that I appreciate that is asking a lot, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to do that. And that, it seems to me, puts a responsibility on all of us, which I know I don't take lightly, and I know Bob Kincaid and his folks don't take lightly either. So thank you. Before we begin in earnest with today's program, I would like to share with you our phone number. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you, very honestly, on the election results yesterday. I kind of made a comment or two about mine. I haven't talked about any particular race or whatever, but I would love to hear, and I think our listeners would enjoy hearing your thoughts and your ideas on the election as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-HORN. That's 304-663-4676, which on your phone pad, 4676, translate into HORN, which of course is the acronym for the Head On Radio Network. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you personally. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I mentioned the piece that came into my hands as a result of a link that Gene, one of the Head On family, Gene made available to me. I guess he does this with a lot of folks at the Horn. He basically reads the internet and knows what's there. And I appreciate so well the fact that he sends me link after link after link, and thinks, again, with the idea that they are things that I ought to read, and more importantly, that they are things that perhaps our listeners ought to know about as well. And we are here at the Virtual Center, we are in our 20th month of broadcasting, and one of the things that I've learned during that 20-month period is that the recommendations and suggested links that Gene sends me are links that I should look at very carefully. And this particular one that I want to address today came to me that way, and I want to thank Gene for that. The article in question appeared in Germany in Der Spiegel, which is the German publication, the German daily. and it was translated from German into the English with a publication date of October 23rd, 2014. So we are talking about an article that originally appeared not much more than a week ago on Spiegel Online. The title of the article, How Capitalism Has Gone Off the Rails. The author, Michael Sauga, S-A-U-G-A. How Capitalism Has Gone Off the Rails. Specifically, this article mentions something called a zombie system of finance. And I want to begin addressing the substance of this particular piece by sharing a couple of realities with you, the audience here at the Virtual Center, the participants. I call you an audience because I'm talking and you're listening at this point. But we know that with the availability of the phone number and with our constant solicitation of your input into the program, you are much more than an audience to comments that I would make or comments that anyone else would make. That rather we are all participants in this same effort, in this same initiative to try to know more and understand more know more and understand more about what's going on in the world around us. And I was particularly struck when I saw the term zombie system, because I was really intrigued what exactly that might mean. I mentioned that before getting into the substance of this piece, I need to say a few things about the topic itself. And that is, I am not an economist. And I will admit that much of what's in this article and articles like it is a little bit beyond my pay grade, as it were, because it deals with with a level of finance that I'm not comfortable with, that I don't know that much about. When I talk about having my retirement funds invested, what that means is I've turned them over to people I like and trust to make decisions that are in my best interests. I recognize that they are being paid a fee for this. They aren't just doing it out of friendship or loyalty to me. This is their job. But the fact of the matter is, what I want to emphasize is the degree to which I am totally dependent on the advice and recommendations of these people. One of the people that I'm thinking of in this, one of my so-called financial advisors, and when I say that, you may say, my God, he has more than one financial advisor. What's he worth? Well, please understand that I'm not worth all that much, and I don't have all that much in retirement. In fact, I'm one of those people that kind of scratches my head occasionally and wonders whether in fact I might actually outlive my savings, my retirement, which is kind of the operative expression that everybody goes in. Whatever you do, make sure you don't outlive your retirement. Well, again, a lot of that is contingent on how much retirement there is to outlive. And I don't really have that much, and I know that. And I, in fact, thought seriously about retirement, whether in fact I ought to retire at all. I had actually thought that I might be one of these people that would continue to go right up until the very end, because I really didn't feel that I had the kind of funds available to me that made anything else impossible. But a number of things happened, work-related as well as personal, that made me realize that it was time to really think about seriously retiring. And that meant that I had to trust the I have some of my funds with one advisor who is a long-term friend of mine, and I brought the balance of my retirement savings to yet another person who's become a good friend of mine in recent years. And while these two people both know each other and represent different firms, I was very, very careful to make clear to both of them that the fact that I had split my business between the two of them is not really a reflection on either one. In fact, it's a desire to do what I could do to bring business to both. And I wanted them to know that. I didn't want my friend, who we've been friends ever since I've been in West Virginia, which is more than 20 years, I didn't want him to think that the fact that I was trusting someone else to deal with part of my retirement was in any way a negative reflection on what he's done for me at all. And so that's why I have more than one. But to call them financial advisors may be a misnomer, because they are indeed financial advisors. They're basically advising me what to do, but I've made it clear to them on more than one occasion that they aren't advising me what to do. They're effectively telling me what to do, because I don't know enough to do other than what they tell me. To be honest with you, I don't believe, I've told my wife this many, many times, I don't believe that I'm a stupid person. And what I mean is that to be so lacking in the substance and the details of finance is a little bit embarrassing to me at this point in my life. I feel like I ought to know more. And I can remember when I was on a radio talk show some years ago, it was about a dozen years ago now. I can remember a caller taking issue with me when we got into this very topic. And basically my presentation was, what I was saying at that point during that program was that I felt that people in the United States tend to be the most uninformed people about finance. That the fact of the matter is that going into the business of finance, majoring in finance in college, and then hiring on as an advisor to one of these large financial firms, be it TIAA, CREF, or Ameriprise, or Wells Fargo, or any of these other organizations, it's a major industry, it's a major job category in our economy. And it's been my belief for a long time that part of the reason that so many people can earn a lucrative living as financial advisors in our society is because our general population is so woefully uninformed about how the economy works, and in effect are really not capable or qualified to make the kind of important financial decisions about their own money that they really ought to be making. I find this to be a significant deficiency on my part. I feel like I ought to know more, but I don't. And the fact of the matter is, I really do believe that it's not totally my fault that I don't. I don't think we teach finance in school. I don't think we do a good job teaching it. Part of the reason is I don't know many teachers who really understand it either. And so consequently, what it is they do tell their students about economics and about the economy is pretty much what the curriculum tells them to say. And the fact of the matter is, what I have learned is that we have an economy that functions around, as much as anything else, on faith. And part of the way we teach our young people finance is to instill in them a faith that it works. Because if the system functions on faith, and if the system becomes vulnerable when citizens' faith in it is questioned or is compromised, then it stands to reason the way we educate everybody else about everything else, the way we handle our education, it stands to reason that we would indoctrinate in our finance education and economic education as well as everything else. And so consequently, we are dealing with a citizenry whose understanding of finance revolves more about what they believe than what they know and understand. I realize that many people are fascinated, many people do handle their own investments, many people are fascinated by the topic, many people are driven by the ability to make money in the market and in their investments, and driven thereby to become much more expert in the internal operations of the financial system than the rest of us. But I would suggest that the fact that there is an industry out there of financial advisors, I think it speaks volumes to what American citizens don't know about the way their retirement works, about the way Social Security works, about the way their investments work, about the way the financial markets work. Consequently, as a result of doing programs and as a result of initiatives like the Virtual Center itself, I've indirectly and inadvertently been forced in a number of situations to learn more about the economy than perhaps I really wanted to know. And so perhaps I'm one of those people that has become guilty of what we often hear referred to as he doesn't know much, but he knows enough to be dangerous. And I think that might apply to me when it comes to economics. I say all of this as an introduction because some of the issues and some of the elements of the presentation that I want to spend our time focusing on today are indeed above my pay grade. But the fact of the matter is, I've read this particular piece 3 times. And every time I've gone through it, I've come away with a stronger feeling that this is something that all of us here at the Virtual Center need to read, hear about, reflect upon, and to the degree possible, understand. I am perfectly aware that there are going to be people listening to us here at the Virtual Center who know much more about this subject than I do. And I want to begin right at the start by urging these people to pick up the phone and give us a call. Because if we are not correct, or we are wrong, or I am wrong, then I think if you're out there and you know where we're wrong, then all of us need to hear from you. Not just me, all of us. Because I think the one thing we know about here at the Virtual Center is that the people who regularly visit us and get together during these programs are people who are in the business of wanting to know and wanting to understand more than they currently do. With that, let me at least use the 20-25 minutes left in our first hour today, at least gaining entry into this presentation and raising a few of the issues that I think all of us need to think about. Let me also begin, before we begin, let me also make the comment that I think I made at the very beginning of our program today, that if we are successful, I think you're going to find before we end our time together today, we will all see a significant link between what's in this particular presentation on high finance and yesterday's elections. I think yesterday's elections and the results and the influence of big money on the campaign that just ended yesterday suggests that many of the issues raised and much of the concern raised about our financial system in this article is borne out, or was borne out, in our recent elections. So I think in that sense, we are quite timely. As I mentioned, the publication date for this article in the online version of Spiegel was October 23rd, which was, again, not quite 2 weeks ago. The opening paragraph, it seems to me, is a hook. And what I mean is, the piece opens with the kind of statement that almost forces the reader to continue reading on because it's powerful. And it is intended to be that as the opening statement because it's designed to hook the reader or to attract attention. 6 years after the Lehman Brothers disaster, the industrialized world, is suffering from what the author calls Japan syndrome. Growth is minimal. Another crash may be brewing, and the gulf between rich and poor continues to widen. Can the global economy reinvent itself? Again, the opening sentence of this article suggests real danger. 6 years after the failure of Lehman Brothers, the industrial world continues to suffer from growth, economic growth that is at best minimal. The world economy seems to function with the idea of another crash or another financial disaster looming ahead of us. And as we know, the gulf between rich and poor seems to be continuing to get wider and wider. The author points out that in financial circles around the world, and he includes the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and at the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund, the word or the buzzword that continues to be heard at these international financial sessions is the word inclusion. And basically, it's being used, inclusion is being used in a very, very particular way. Namely, it refers to a trait that Western industrialized nations seem to be on the verge of losing. Whatever inclusion there was in the economic sectors of the various industrialized nations of the West seems to be rapidly disappearing. And this has been a topic of discussion at some of the most significant financial sessions around the world, whether it's the World Economic Forum at Davos or the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund. And as you know, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund is to fund economic growth in underdeveloped nations, to provide the capital that is designed to promote industrial development in these countries and render these countries not only commercial producers in the world market, but also to transform their citizens into potential customers in an expanded world or global economic system of trade. The word exclusion, according to this piece, is a word that increasingly Western nations are on the cusp of losing. The ability to allow as many layers of society as possible to benefit from economic advancement and to participate in political life. In that definition of inclusion, this economic definition of inclusion, there are two elements that I think all of us need to focus on or to be aware of. The first one is that inclusion means the ability to allow as many layers of society as possible to benefit from economic advancement. The second principle that I think is significant here is the final one, which is not only to participate or benefit from economic advancement, but also to participate in political life. And what that suggests is that political life and economic advancement are connected. They are two parts of the same equation, if you will. And obviously there is an implication here that economic advancement can't happen without the necessary political support. And more important, that informed participation in politics more and more involves the ingredients of economic advancement. I think what that says to me is that the financial experts of the industrial world all recognize that in order for capitalism to work the way it is designed to work, it requires two things, which is a relationship between economics and politics, a working relationship between governments and their economic sectors, and also an economy that penetrates deep into every national society, every nation's economy, to include as many layers, as many citizens as possible. The more inclusion there is in economic advancement and economic development, the stronger the economy is. And consequently, the more effective government's participation in the economic advancement issue, the more effective government's participation is. So the fact that inclusion is disappearing and the fact that the major financial leaders of the world are worried about it suggests to me that we should be worried about it, that I should be worried about it. And the opening sentence here, which suggests the idea of another looming crash, when I'm one of those, along with, I'm sure, a lot of other people, who hasn't fully recovered from the last one in 2007 and 2008, and now they're talking about the possibility of another one, and I'm already retired, which means there's no way that I can bounce back, or I can recover, or I can make up lost ground. Consequently, I'm vulnerable, totally, to the kinds of economic and political decisions that drive Western economics. I'm not a player anymore. I'm at the point where I need to depend on the fact that the decisions being made are the right ones. And here are the major economic leaders of the world worried. And I guess what I've got to say is when they worry, I worry. And here we are, 2 short paragraphs into this article. And already we are at a place where I think it is appropriate to begin to make a comment or two about yesterday's election. Because I think that what we saw in yesterday's election results is the victory of a philosophy which is alien to the very idea of inclusion that so concerns the world's financial experts. They are worried about the shrinking levels of inclusion in economic advancement. And yet the American people went to the polls yesterday and overwhelmingly voted for candidates and policies and programs that are rooted in exacerbating and expanding and increasing the reduction of inclusion. In effect, what elections results in yesterday's elections seem to say, in one context at least, was that the American voting population bought into the priorities of those whose obscene amounts of money poured into the election campaigns got the American people to vote for political candidates whose priority is to increase the exclusion of more and more citizens from meaningful participation in economic decision making, rather to trust their economic futures to those who heretofore are making decisions and yesterday won an election, which means that they will be making more and more independent decisions that directly affect the economy and directly affect the livelihood of citizens, not only in this nation, but in all nations. In effect, what I'm saying is that those who won in our elections yesterday and the behavior that they represent and the philosophical priorities that they stand for are the very elements that precipitated this article of concern. It was a victory for the people, to put this as bluntly as I can. Our elections yesterday were a victory for the political and economic philosophies of those those who would take the trends that are already worrying the world's financial leaders and moving further on in the very direction of those trends. And if the financial experts were worried before yesterday's election, I'm even more worried now. And that, more than anything else, is what prompted my decision today to make this particular article the focus of today's session at the Virtual Center. We are, at this point, 1/3 of the way into an article, and into the first page of an article that constitutes a number of pages. So I'm not sure whether we're going to make it or not, but I am also sure already, just in the first 3 paragraphs, that what we are seeing already makes the pursuit and the time committed to grasping as much as we can out of the meaning of this article significant and worthwhile. You'll remember, we're back in the article now, you'll remember that the issue or the term under consideration was the idea of inclusion. The author continues, the term is now even being used at meetings of a more exclusive character, as was the case in London in May, 6 months ago. Some 250 wealthy and extremely wealthy individuals, from Google chairman Eric Schmidt to Unilever CEO Paul Polman, gathered in a venerable castle on the Thames to lament the fact that in today's capitalism, there is too little left over for the lower income classes. Think about this. In May of 2014, 250 of the world's wealthiest individuals got together on the Thames and shared their concerns about the fact that there's too little left over in today's economic system for the poor. Why would they say that? Why are they worried enough to make this a topic of discussion at an international financial conference? Because they know that if you exclude too many people from the ability to participate effectively in the economic system, in their own economic livelihood, you are creating the groundwork, if you will, for revolution. You are laying the groundwork for what Karl Marx predicted would be the overthrow of capitalism itself. You don't need the left to point this out. You don't need Marxists to point this out. All you need to do is look at the number of people that are totally being left outside the mainstream, that are not being included in the economy. And then you look at the results of yesterday's election, and you wonder, why did Americans vote this way? Unless what they know is what they're being told by the people who have the money and the resources to be able to afford to tell them over and over and over again, this is who you want in office. These are the people we don't want. And consequently, we have an explanation of the very negative character of our campaigns, where so much of the biggest money was being spent on elections that didn't name a positive candidate. They weren't for anybody. They were all aimed against certain people. And the fact of the matter is, it worked. Because the people who lost most yesterday were the targets of this negative campaigning that has been funded by big money, which was given its blessing, if you will, by the Supreme Court in Citizens United and the various follow-up decisions that followed upon it. The Supreme Court majority, 5-4 conservative majority, won yesterday's election, if you look at it from that perspective. And if you look at the ages of the justices on the Supreme Court, there's absolutely no question that one of the major issues on the ballot in yesterday's elections that few citizens recognized or seemed to understand was the fact that the results of yesterday's election were probably going to directly impact the appointment of one, perhaps even two, retiring Supreme Court justices over the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Consequently, there's little likelihood, short of an amendment to the Constitution itself, that Citizens United is going to be undone for a time. To go on with this about the London conference held in May, former United States President Bill Clinton, who was there, found fault with what he called, quote, the uneven distribution of opportunity in our economies. While the International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde was critical of the numerous financial scandals that were happening in one nation after the other. And finally, the hostess of the meeting itself, bank heir Lynn Forster de Rothschild, said she was concerned about social cohesion, noting that citizens had lost confidence in their governments. In a later paragraph in the same article, the author returns to the issue of what's going on in our democratic governments around the world in terms of economies. And the general consensus among the experts seems to be that citizens are increasingly worried because our democracies are not being governed by Congresses and Senates or by House of Commons and parliaments. Rather, our governments are being governed by financial institutions in the various nations, i.e. in ours, Wall Street. That what we have is a system where the financial sector and the political sector have become so close that in effect government's political decisions are being made by those whose financial self-interest is at stake. And as we've seen with the gap between rich and poor that is emerging not only in our own country, but clearly from this article throughout the Western industrialized economies, the people with economic power and influence are getting richer, while the vast majority of citizens are increasingly losing out. And as this article points out, are being included less and less in the financial decision making under which they live in their own nations. I think we have a problem. I think it's a real problem. And even though we haven't gotten that far into this article yet, we've already gone beyond the top of our first hour. We're at 4 minutes after the hour, 4 minutes after 2 in the East. We've only begun to fight, so to speak. But I believe that what we've already reflected upon and already expressed were the kinds of concerns that make focus on this particular article worth our time here at the Virtual Center. So I encourage you to stay tuned while we pause and take a short break. We're at 4 minutes after the hour. We will return for the second hour of the Virtual Center in today's program. We'll continue our pursuit of this particular article. Our break will be a short one. I encourage you to stay tuned and I want to thank you for staying tuned to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. After a short break, we'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility with your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien. And music like that can't get you up and out of your post-election doldrums. Nothing can.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. I did enjoy it. I appreciated that so very much. Thank you. This is Bill O'Brien. It is our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We are in our day after the elections blues, so to speak. I'm guessing that. I know that I am. I think I told somebody today I think we'll rue the day in a lot of different ways. Here in West Virginia, for example, we defeated our longtime congressman who was in line to be chairman of the House Transportation Committee in a state which is so woefully deficient in the areas of transportation, and instead replaced him with a new congressman who's going to be so far removed from the decision making of the Transportation Committee or any other committee that, in effect, whatever little bit of influence the state of West Virginia might have had in Washington and the Congress of the United States is effectively gone. Of course, when Senator Robert C. Byrd died a few years ago, that was the major influence in what came out of Washington that West Virginia had. So that was the worst, the major blow. But I think the defeat of Congressman Rahal is probably the final blow. But again, that's just me talking. Glad you were with us. Thank you if you have stayed with us and have been with us through our first hour. We appreciate you staying with us. If you're just joining us, welcome. We are into an article on the economies of the Western world, if you will, a critical concern, if you will, based on the concerns of some of the wealthiest and most influential financial leaders in the Western world, who have gathered at a number of international conferences, including the Economic Conference at Davos in Switzerland, the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund, and the specific one that we've been making reference to most recently, a meeting that occurred in England of 250 of the world's wealthiest individuals that occurred this past May. And the general topic of discussion at that conference was a concern about what's happening in the economies, in the Western economies, the scandals, the fraud, the growing gap between rich and poor, and the extent to which, rather than governments regulating and managing and directing and making sure that financial decisions are being made in the interests of the nation as a whole, in other words, in the public interest, that instead the self-interest of leading financial gurus is really dictating government policy in so many nations that the leaders, the wealthiest individuals, are beginning to worry about it. Because the fact of the matter is that the impact of economic advancement into the various societies in question here has become so shallow and so low that the fact of the matter is larger and larger portions of the populations in these countries are effectively excluded from their own economies. And these people understand world finance well enough to know that when the vast majority of the citizens in the Western world are not able to participate effectively in their own economic livelihood, it only stands to reason that eventually their support for that financial system is going to dissipate. And they are more than aware of that. And I think this is an article that all of us need to hear, because one of the things we know in this country is that our citizens know so little about finance, about international finance, about the nature of economies and all the rest of it. I'll be very forward, perhaps, and probably going further than I dare go by making a comment. But I would say that proof positive of how little Americans know about the economy and about what's best for them in today's world is the way they voted yesterday. That may be a bit extreme, but I firmly believe that. I invite you to participate and share your thoughts and your ideas, whether it's on the election or on the financial issues being raised here in this article at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. That translates into 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. It's 14 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East, which means effectively we've got a little bit less than 45 minutes left in our program today. So let's see how much of this we can digest, because after today we won't be here for a while, but when we come back next week for the Virtual Center, we'll return to this article, hopefully. Just before we took our break, from the article, I was quoting a couple of concerns by a few of the people that attended the London conference in May. Bill Clinton, who was concerned, he found fault, he says, with the uneven distribution of opportunity. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, was concerned about the numerous financial scandals that seem to be rocking Western economic circles. And finally, the host of the meeting itself, bank heir Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, said that she was concerned about social cohesion, noting that citizens, quote, have lost confidence in their governments, unquote. This is the beginning of disaster, and I think these people know that. The author goes on and says that it's not necessary for us, of course, to have attended the London conference on inclusive capitalism to understand that industrialized nations have a problem. When the Berlin Wall came down 25 years ago, the West's liberal economic and social order seemed to be on the verge of an unstoppable march of triumph. Communism had failed. Politicians worldwide were singing the praises of deregulation, unregulated markets, and even U.S. political scientist Francis Fukuyama talked about the so-called end of history. In other words, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the rivalry between the communist way of life and the capitalist way of life, so to speak, it appeared that the world was in for good times ahead. And of course, we know that it's been anything but that over the last 25 years. Today, nobody talks about the beneficial effects of unimpeded capital movement. Today, what we're hearing about is stagnation. Larry Summers, former U.S. Secretary and Harvard professor, Harvard president, actually, used the term secular stagnation to talk about what's happened in our economy. It isn't growing even half as quickly as it did in the 1990s. Japan has become a financial disaster in Asia. Europe is sinking into recession and has begun to slow down even in Germany. As we move into the 20th century, we're in the 14th year of the 21st century, capitalism seems to be determined or driven more by uncertainty than anything else. There is all sorts of financial turbulence in the capital world. And the fact that there are these conferences and these financial leaders are talking about the things they're talking about, the lack of social cohesion, the lack of support that people are having for their own governments, faith in their own governments, and on and on and on, suggests a problem. The next section of this article, so there on page 1, if you will, in a nutshell, is the problem. Now to look at the ingredients, the innards of the problem. The next section of this article is entitled Running Out of Ammunition. And basically what it suggests is that the governments of these Western industrialized nations have pretty much run out of options. As the article says, government arsenals are empty. The billions of dollars spent on economic stimulus packages, and of course we remember the TARP program here during the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in 07-08 and into 09 after the November 2008 elections. We had our own stimulus package. The billions that Western nations spent on economic stimulus packages following the financial crisis have created mountains of debt in most industrialized countries. And now these countries lack funds to undertake additional or new spending programs. There has been a perspective about the American economy, specifically about the recovery during the first term and into the first half of the second term of the Obama administration. And the concern of the question is, why has the recovery been so slow, and why hasn't it been more robust? Look at the amount of debt that we incurred. Look at the size of the deficit that we incurred as a result of the stimulus packages during the Obama first term. And of course the criticism in the election held yesterday was the idea that the only thing that got bigger in Obama's first term was the size of the deficit, and that the payoff wasn't worth it. The fact of the matter is, other Western industrialized economies pursued the same kinds of policies. They ended up in deep debt, and none of them have the kind of resources necessary to provide the economic stimulus to cause economic expansion and growth to occur faster and to include more people. There is, as I started to say, there is a perspective in more liberal economic circles in this country, and the name I'm thinking most about here is the name Paul Krugman, who's the Nobel Prize winning economist, just recently retired from Princeton. And Krugman's Krugman's perspective on the recovery was that the reason it was so slow and didn't accomplish more is because it wasn't big enough. And of course his explanation is the reason it wasn't big enough is because conservatives within Congress were constantly forcing President Obama to put the brakes on the recovery to the point that the stimulus wasn't quite as big and quite as effective as it could have been or should have been. And of course there's been a lot of disagreement about that particular perspective. But the fact of the matter is, it's clear from this article that other economies are experiencing the same kind of situation we are. Central banks are running out of ammunition, the author says. They've pushed interest rates close to zero, and have spent hundreds of billions of dollars to buy government bonds. Yet the vast amounts of money they are pumping into the financial sector isn't making its way into the economy. Let's pause here. I banged my microphone here and with my hand. I got a little bit animated. I apologize for that. Let's pause here, because what this suggests is that within reason, there are efforts to pump resources into economic expansion. But the fact of the matter is the resources being spent are not finding their way into the economy. They are going, for the most part, to the very few of the wealthiest at the top of the economy, if that makes sense. The author goes on to explain that. Whether it's Japan, Europe, or the United States, companies are hardly investing in new machinery or factories anymore. Instead, prices are exploding on the global stock market, real estate market, and bond market. A dangerous boom driven by cheap money, not by sustainable growth. This is the issue. We know, we've said this many times before here at the Virtual Center. Corporate America is sitting on trillions of dollars in cash. Inordinate, extreme profit is not being reinvested into economic expansion. It's not going into jobs. It's not going into equipment. It's not going into manufacturing. It's not going into retraining. It's rather going into the pockets of stockholders who are demanding maximum benefit or maximum profit from their investments in stock. And so, in effect, the money that's being appropriated is finding its way into the pockets of those who need it least, and is not finding its way into the economy in order to produce jobs. Consequently, what we are seeing is a boom in stock prices. The stock market continues to go up and up. I was very interested. I checked about an hour or so before we went on the air today. I was very interested in what the impact on the stock market, on the Dow, was as a result of yesterday's elections. When I looked, and this was again about an hour before, around noon today, the Dow was up close to 100 points, about 98 point something. And obviously what that means is that the results of the election yesterday were not negative on Wall Street at all. The market is up 100 points. It may end up to be more than that by the end of the day, or it may go down some. It's hard to predict. But the fact of the matter is the prices of stock are going up. What we are experiencing is an explosion, or a boom, if you will. But it's being driven by cheap money. It's not being driven by growth. The value of stocks and bonds is not going up because the economy is growing. It's growing up because all of this cheap money is driving it. Experts with the Bank for International Settlements have already identified, quote, worrisome signs, unquote, of an impending crash in many areas. Mentioned this in our last hour. Many of us have not recovered from the crash of 07-08. Now there's all sorts of implications here, or suggestions that we might be seeing the beginnings of yet another crash. Worrisome signs. In addition to creating new risks, the article says, the West's crisis policy is exacerbating conflicts in the industrialized nations themselves. Workers' wages are stagnating. Savings accounts are yielding almost no return, nothing. And the wealthier classes, those that derive most of their income by allowing their money to work for them, are profiting handsomely. They're the ones that are driving up the stock market. So in a sense, what we're seeing is that the economies are not being stronger, economic growth is not happening. Rather, the wealthiest classes, the ones who have most of their money out there working for them in terms of pulling profit out of the markets, the bond markets and the stock market and the rest of it, they're the ones that are driving up the Dow, so to speak. But even though the Dow is now approaching 17.5, the fact of the matter is very few proportionally of within the population are deriving any benefit from that expansion. People who have money in savings accounts are getting nothing. In fact, many people are being asked to pay a fee. Banks are charging a fee for the privilege of sitting on your money and investing it. They are making you pay for the money that you have in their bank because they're awash in cash. They don't need it. But what's not happening is that none of this money is being driven or reinvested into the economy. This is a perspective that I would suggest to you prevailed in yesterday's election. Therefore, if this article was a concern before yesterday's election, it's even more of a concern today. The author here concludes this section by saying that the data here indicate a dangerous, what he calls a dangerous malfunction in capitalism's engine room. According to the latest Global Wealth Report by the Boston Consulting Group, worldwide private wealth grew by 15% last year, twice as fast as in the 12-month previously. The wealthier are getting wealthier faster, and everybody else is getting poorer faster. Something's broken, is the general conclusion here. Banks, mutual funds, and investment firms used to ensure that citizens' savings were transformed into technical advances, growth, and new jobs. Investment firms and banks and mutual funds used to mean that what citizens put into savings was being converted into economic expansion or economic growth. But no longer. Today, investment firms and banks and financial institutions are primarily redistributing wealth from the bottom to the top of the respective societies. Prosperity is shrinking instead of growing. An economist at Harvard, Larry Katz, uses this analogy to explain what seems to be happening in the world's financial sectors, especially he's talking about the American economy per se. And this is what he said: that American society has come to resemble a deformed and unstable apartment building. The penthouse at the top is getting bigger and bigger. The lower levels are overcrowded. The middle levels are full of empty apartments, and the elevator has stopped working. What that means is the few at the top are getting wealthier and wealthier. Those at the very bottom, where it's getting crowded, are on the dole. They're being taken care of. And in the middle, where all the economic growth is starting to happen, the apartments are empty. But even more telling than that, there's no way to move up because the elevator's not working. In other words, there's nothing happening in the economy that suggests that this might get better, rather that it'll only continue to get worse. In Germany, which the German economy is one that I've read many articles which suggest that we need to look carefully at the German economy because it's doing really well. But the fact of the matter is, according to this, it's not. Many people in Germany believe that their economy is getting worse. Only one German in 5 believes that economic conditions in Germany are fair. Almost 90% feel that the gap between rich and poor is getting wider and wider. So many of the same things that are happening in the U.S. economy are happening in European economies as well. Even the German economy, which up to very recently was considered to be the model. I mentioned this particular point before, that the crisis of capitalism seems to have turned into a crisis of democracy. Many feel that their countries are no longer being governed by parliaments and by legislatures, but by bank lobbyists who are operating on the logic of suicide bombers to secure their particular privileges. Either they are rescued, bailed out by governments, or they drag the entire economy to its death. In other words, these financial institutions have become so influential and so big and so powerful that they're, so as we use the term in this country, too big to fail. And around in other economies as well, what we have is almost a suicide bomber mentality. They're holding us all hostage. If we don't come to their rescue, they'll drag us into the sewer. And this suggests something very, very dangerous. And it is in this context, then, that the book by Thomas Piketty, the economic study by Thomas Piketty, that has sold so well and become such an influence, is gaining influence. If you remember, Piketty's thesis is that capitalism itself dictates a widening gap between rich and poor. And the only way to avoid that is through some sort of government action to avoid it. If government goes along with the priorities of the capitalists, rather than putting the public interest first and doing management-wise in overseeing the economy and regulating private capital, if government doesn't pursue policies which counter capitalism's tendency to create a wider and wider gap between rich and poor, then government ceases to be solution to the problem and government becomes part of it. And then this article goes into the story of one Michael Mayo, M-A-Y-O, Michael Mayo. And in fact, they're referring to him that among bank analysts, he's considered to be a rock star because he predicted the most recent recession, and he was fired for doing it. He was an advisor at Lehman Brothers. He worked for a number of other financial institutions on Wall Street, and he got in trouble because he was pointing out some of the weaknesses in the system, in the economy, which are indeed the essence of this particular article. Joseph Schumpeter, I misspoke. Joseph Schumpeter, S-C-H-U-M-P-E-T-E-R, who was an Austrian economist in the 30s and 40s. Schumpeter is the one who came up with the term creative destruction when talking about capitalism. And Schumpeter argued that a vibrant capitalism is one that is always destroying businesses and creating others. That capitalism, when it's functioning as it should, is constantly in the process of what he called creative destruction. That some are going out of business, but new companies are coming into business. And that is really the result of the economy when it is functioning as it should. He also pointed out, did Schumpeter, that banks were the engines of this whole process, that banks really guaranteed progress. They were the institutions created by the financial sector to make sure that the system of free finance and capital was indeed functioning as it should. But here's the kicker, and this is Michael Mayo. He made this point. Financial institutions haven't performed this function, the one that Schumpeter talks about, guarantors of progress, for a long time. Before the financial crisis, Mayo said, they were the drivers, banks were the drivers of untenable expansion of debt that caused the crash. Now, focused as they are on repairing the damage done, they are inhibiting the recovery. The amount of credit ought to be 6 times faster than it has been, says Mayo. Banks aren't engines of growth anymore because banks are afraid to lend. They will not lend. They will not fund new governments. They are holding capital prisoner to their own fears because of the damage that they experienced during the recent recessions. So whereas the banks and financial institutions ought to be funding recovery and funding economic growth, they've become reluctant risk takers who are making it more and more difficult for businesses to get their hands, new businesses to get their hand on money. For these kinds of predictions and these kinds of statements, Mike Mayo, who predicted the recession in 07-08, has been fired. He worked for companies like UBS and Prudential Securities. He saw how top executives were diverting funds into their own pockets during merger. He became very concerned about what he felt were moral and ethical flaws in the way the capital markets were functioning. And what bothered him most of all was that his employers penalized him for doing his job, namely that he was supposed to be writing critical analyses of the banks. He lost his job at Lehman Brothers because he had downgraded a financial institution which Lehman Brothers with whom they wanted to do business. Credit Suisse fired him because he recommended selling most U.S. bank stocks. Only when the real estate bubble burst in 07 and 08 did the financial industry realize that Michael Mayo knew what he was talking about. Today, he writes for an Asian brokerage firm, CLSA, and he's basically saying things like the following. Central banks have kept lenders alive with low interest rates. Governments have forced them to take up additional capital and comply with thousands of pages of new regulations. And contrary to what was supposed to be happening during the recession, the biggest banks haven't shrunk, they've gotten even bigger. If they were too big to fail before, then Mayo points out they're too big to fail now. And so it seems like rather than getting better, the economies in the Western industrialized nations are getting worse and worse and worse. and it's becoming political. And this is an issue. We are at 43 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 15 minutes left in our program today. I wanted to suggest this is a particular section of the article about Switzerland, and everybody knows that Swiss banks were the place where investors used to put their money. Switzerland began to house the profits of the well-to-do from around the world in the world economies. One businessman in Switzerland has a window factory there. His name is Marcus Wenger. Wenger in Switzerland is advocating raising the inheritance tax, because what has happened is that so many very wealthy people profited from the recent recession in the Western economies and parked their money in Switzerland, that the fact of the matter is that all of this money's there, but the Swiss government and the Swiss people are not getting any of the benefits of it. So what Wenger is advocating in Switzerland is an increase in the inheritance tax in order that the society at large can derive some benefit from the amount of capital invested, the amount of profit invested there. Wenger points out that the amount of money we're talking about reminds one of medieval princes, the wealth of medieval princes. He says income isn't the problem in Switzerland, where the gap between rich and poor is no wider than in Germany or France. The problem is assets. No other country has as many major shareholders, financiers, and investors, and in no country is as much capital concentrated in so few hands. The assets of the 100 wealthiest Swiss citizens have increased almost fivefold in the last 25 years. In Zurich, for example, the 10 richest residents own as much as the poorest 500,000 residents. Wealth has become so concentrated in Switzerland, Wenger says, that it rivals the wealth of medieval princes. And the government of Switzerland benefits not at all from this wealth. Consequently, there is a move afoot to increase the taxes on the wealthy in order to help them or make them pay for the economic livelihood of other people. Wenger asked the question, doesn't it make sense to extract an additional contribution from those Swiss citizens who hardly pay any taxes at all today on their rapidly growing finances in our own country? Wenger says that the answer is obvious, but he also knows that other business leaders don't agree with him. He says they talk about, quote, an attack by the left, and prefer to support those who basically want to continue the concentration of more and more money in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And what they're doing is the same thing that happened in this country whenever people raise a question about how much money so few people have. They immediately begin to interpret that or to label that as an attack from the left, from socialists, and from radicals. And then finally, and this I think will be the last major issue in this article that we'll have time for today, but the article toward the middle of the particular piece begins to address a person that all of us can remember, and remember the name very well. I do. It's David Stockman. Do you remember that David Stockman was the finance manager in the Reagan administration in the 1980s? He was the guy with the glasses and the portfolio that sold America on the ideal of trickle-down economics. The idea that when the wealthy people got richer, the result was more money going back into the economy and the creation of more jobs and more opportunity for more people. And as we know, this was Reaganomics, and the American political establishment bought into it hook, line, and sinker. We also know that David Stockman himself finally acknowledged when he bailed out of the Reagan administration that, I remember this phrase so very well in the book he wrote in the late 80s, that the numbers don't add up, that trickle-down economics was a farce. And the person who sold it, David Stockman, is the person who's telling us that. This is about David Stockman. Most of us, and myself included, were not even aware that David Stockman was still around. Lo and behold, David Stockman was deeply enmeshed in the Lehman Brothers situation. I didn't know that. After the introduction of David Stockman, and the fact that 30 years after he left the Reagan administration, Stockman is living in an enormous mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, an affluent suburb of New York. If you've ever driven through there, you know what they're talking about. I've done it. It's a suburb of New York City, and many of those who were kind of the superstars of the hedge fund industry in the recent recession live there. And the article makes the point that they live in these huge mansions behind red brick walls, and there's a Jeep owned by private security companies parked at almost every street corner in Greenwich. The people who got rich in the most recent recession, the hedge fund folks who live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and in communities like that, are in hiding. And they have hired private security firms to protect them from angry citizens. Stockman has been one of them. But, as this article points out, Stockman currently is moving to New York into an apartment that he's already rented in Manhattan. It's not entirely clear, the author says, whether Stockman is moving to be closer to TV studios and newspaper editors, or whether his move back to Manhattan signifies a change in lifestyle. Quote, "It was a life that took him through the executive suites of Washington politics and the U.S. financial industry. A life that has placed Stockman in an almost unparalleled position to recount the aberrations of American capitalism in the last 3 decades. Quote from David Stockman, "We have financialized central bank-dominated casinos," he says. "That is undermining the fundamentals of a healthy, growing capitalist economy." Ironically, Stockman was the one who wanted to reshape that society back in the 80s, when Reagan made him organizer of his shift to so-called supply-side economics. Stockman believed in free markets, low taxes, and in reducing the role of government. He also believed in healthy finances, and this caused him to run into problems with other members of Ronald Reagan's staff, including, for those of you who remember, the name Donald Reagan, who was the one principally responsible for the idea of the Reagan administration taking very, very strong positions against the idea of taxing the rich, against tax increases of the wealthy. At that point, Stockman left the administration. Quote, this is David Stockman, "The Republican concept of starving the beast is the worst thing in terms of fiscal rectitude that you can imagine, Stockman says. It's even worse than the Keynesian models of the Democrats. So what Stockman is saying now is that the very policies he helped to promote and to sell in this country are policies that he believes are putting the nature of our economy at risk. David Stockman believes that we might be on the edge of another crash. And then the article talks a little bit about the relationship between David Stockman and Alan Greenspan. And the idea for the benefit of investors of keeping interest rates low. One would think that Greenspan's policy of keeping interest rates low would make it possible for businesses to expand by borrowing. Money has never been so cheap as it has been in recent years under when the Fed was controlled by Alan Greenspan, because interest rates were kept artificially low. One would think that that would translate into economic expansion and economic growth. One would think, and I've heard this argument made many times, that with the infrastructure of our nation being in such need, money has never been cheaper. Unemployment, the need for jobs has never been greater. Why don't we, meaning the states and the nation, Congress, why don't we borrow money at the exorbitantly low rates that money's available at and use that money and put it into the strengthening of our infrastructure? It would create jobs. It would put people to work. It would generate revenue. It would cause economic expansion and economic growth. And it would help to pull us even further out of the recession. Why hasn't that happened? Stockman is asking. By reducing interest rates, whenever large financial institutions ran into trouble, the issue was that it was the financial institutions that were being bailed out by the Fed. It was not the economy that was being stimulated or benefited. These kinds of deals, well, let me read this because I think this is worthy of a quote. Greenspan's policy of cheap money became a poison for Wall Street, the chief ingredient of the dangerous debt cocktails brewed by the wizards of London and New York investment banks, with David Stockman front and center. The former politician became a virtuoso of the leveraged buyout, a complex financial deal in which an investor buys companies with borrowed money, restructures them or carves them up, and then sells them at a profit. These deals made David Stockman rich. They also turned him into an acknowledged junkie. He says, I became an addict. I became caught up in the process of using the availability of cheap money made available by low interest rates under the Greenspan policy. And these large investment firms were buying out failing businesses and selling them. That's where the low interest rates and the money was going. It was primarily making its way through the financial circles of Wall Street and the equivalents of Wall Street in financial circles in Europe, London, Paris, Berlin, and other places. The availability of cheap money because of low interest rates did nothing to stimulate the economy. And so it seems to me, and we have to close here because we're at 58 minutes after the hour. We've got less than 2 minutes left in today's program. But the burning question is, where was government during all of this, and why didn't government intervene and take advantage of the low interest rates in order to stimulate the economy, create jobs, expand education, and promote the kind of economic growth that would have made the situation a benefit rather than a negative? And I guess that's the issue that we'll have to hold until next time. For the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, on this Wednesday, the day after Election Day, November 5th, 2014, I want to thank you for listening. I want to encourage you to please enjoy your weekend, but please be safe. We want you back with us here at the Virtual Center. And I invite you to join us when we get together again the first of next week here at the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. I want to thank you for listening. Have a great evening and a great week. Thank you.